You know how it is when you move to a new neighborhood, right? Everything feels fresh, like a new beginning. Sarah felt that same way when she moved into her little house on Maplewood Drive. It was everything she wanted. Peaceful, quiet, just a short drive from her new job. The perfect escape from the hustle of city life. But sometimes, the things you don't see right away, they find you when you least expect it. Sarah had been going through a tough time, leaving behind an old relationship, looking for a fresh start. Her new home seemed like the perfect place to rebuild her life. The neighborhood was full of families, retirees, and young couples, all with their own routines. Her house was modest but charming, tucked into the end of a cul-de-sac, with a small garden and an old oak tree in the yard. But it was the house next door that really caught her eye. From the moment she moved in, something felt off about it. Unlike the well-maintained homes on the street, this one seemed stuck in time. The grass was overgrown, the shutters were crooked, and the paint was chipped and peeling. It looked forgotten. She didn't see anyone going in or out during the day. At first, she assumed it was just an empty house. Maybe it had been on the market for a while, or the owners were away. But when the sun went down, something changed. Sarah first noticed it on her third night in the house. She had been unpacking boxes late into the evening and finally decided to call it a night. As she was about to draw the curtains in her bedroom, she saw it. A faint glow coming from the house next door. It wasn't like any light she had seen before, too dim to be from a lamp, but not natural either. It flickered slightly, casting an eerie shadow across the old blinds. She stood there, staring at the window for a few moments, wondering if maybe the lights were on a timer. But there was something unsettling about the way the house seemed to come alive only at night. The next day, she decided to casually mention it to one of her neighbors, Mrs. Finch, an elderly woman who lived a few houses down. Mrs. Finch was kind, but seemed reluctant to talk about the house next door. "Oh, that old place? That's Mr. Whitaker's house. He's been there for years. Keeps to himself mostly. Nothing to worry about, dear." There was something in Mrs. Finch's voice, a strange note of caution that made Sarah uneasy. But she pushed the feeling aside. It was probably nothing, just an old man living alone, keeping his distance from the world. A week passed, and Sarah settled into her new routine. Work, home, unpacking, repeat. But the glow from next door kept nagging at her. Every night, without fail, the light would appear, and it seemed to pulse, as if something was alive inside. One night, while lying in bed, unable to sleep, she glanced out her window toward the old house. That's when she saw him, Mr. Whitaker. He was standing at the window, motionless, staring out. His face was pale, almost ghostly in the faint light. There was no expression, no emotion, just stillness. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She quickly pulled the curtain closed and forced herself to go to sleep. But the image of him, standing there, burned in her mind. What was he doing? Why was he just standing there, watching the street? Or was he watching her? The following days were uneventful, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house next door. Each night, the light would appear, and Mr. Whitaker would be there, staring out into the darkness. Then, one night, Sarah woke up suddenly, her heart racing. She wasn't sure why she had woken up, but something felt off. She lay there, listening to the silence of the house. But then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was coming from outside her window. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint, like someone lightly knocking on the glass. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she pulled back the curtain, expecting to see Mr. Whitaker standing there, staring at her from his window. But there was no one, just the faint glow from his house. She sat up in bed, wide awake now. The tapping had stopped, but the unease lingered. She didn't sleep well that night, or the next. And each night, the knocking returned, just as faint, just as unsettling. Then came the whispers. They started out so quietly that she wasn't sure if she was imagining them. A soft, almost inaudible voice calling her name. Sarah. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her. Maybe it was the stress of the move, or just being in a new house. But the whispers grew louder, more persistent. And they always came at the same time, right after the tapping on the window. Sarah. Come closer. She tried to ignore it, tried to rationalize it, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every time she glanced toward the old house, Mr. Whitaker was there, standing in the window, motionless, like a statue. It was as if he was waiting for something. Sarah began to withdraw from the outside world. She stopped talking to her neighbors, stopped going out in the evenings. The glow from the house and the tapping on the window consumed her thoughts. Her work suffered, and sleep became a rare luxury. One evening, while taking out the trash, she noticed something unusual. The house next door was completely dark. No light, no glow, no Mr. Whitaker at the window. For the first time in weeks, it looked abandoned again. Relieved, she thought, maybe it was over. Maybe Mr. Whitaker had moved, or maybe the house was finally empty. But the relief didn't last long. The next morning, Mrs. Finch was gone. Her car was still in the driveway, but she didn't answer the door. Sarah asked the other neighbors, but no one had seen her. It was like she had vanished overnight, and yet no one seemed all that concerned. They just shrugged it off, saying she must have gone to visit family or something. But Sarah knew better. She had seen Mrs. Finch the night before, standing in her yard, staring at Mr. Whitaker's house. And now, she was gone. The strange occurrences grew worse. Sarah was now hearing the whispers, not just at night, but during the day, too, in her own house. The voices followed her wherever she went, whispering her name, calling her closer to the window. One night, after a particularly bad day at work, Sarah snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. She needed to know what was happening in that house. Why was Mr. Whitaker watching her? What was causing the light? What had happened to Mrs. Finch? She grabbed a flashlight and marched next door. The front door was unlocked, and she stepped inside, her heart racing. The air inside was stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. Dust covered everything, and the house was eerily silent. She made her way upstairs, toward the room where she had seen Mr. Whitaker standing night after night. The door was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open. The room was empty, save for an old armchair facing the window. On the windowsill was a small, flickering light, barely visible in the darkness. And there, on the floor, was a photo. Sarah picked it up, her hands trembling. It was a picture of Mr. Whitaker, standing at the window, just as she had seen him so many times before. But the photo was old, faded and yellowed with age. And the date on the back? 1982. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the room, louder than before. Sarah. She spun around, but no one was there. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, closing in. Panicking, she fled the house, running back to her own, her heart pounding in her chest. She slammed the door behind her, locking it tight. But when she looked back toward her bedroom window, she saw him, Mr. Whitaker. standing there, in her window, watching her. Sarah never felt safe in her house again. The tapping, the whispers, and the ghostly figure of Mr. Whitaker haunted her every night. She couldn't escape it. No matter where she went, she felt his gaze. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah grew more and more isolated. She tried to move away, but something always stopped her. It was as if the house had a hold on her, pulling her back, keeping her trapped. And then, one night, the tapping stopped. The whispers fell silent. For the first time in months, there was only silence. Sarah hoped it was over. But as she lay in bed, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, she heard one final whisper, faint and distant. "I'll always be watching." Sarah closed her eyes, knowing she would never truly be free. What would you do if you knew someone was watching you, even when you're alone? If you enjoyed tonight's story and you're ready for more sleepless nights, hit the like button and share it with someone who might also love a good scare. Don't forget to subscribe and join our growing community of night owls who live for the thrill of the unknown. And let me know in the comments below. Have you ever had a neighbor you couldn't quite figure out? Or maybe you've had an eerie experience of your own. I want to hear your story. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss our next creepy tale. New stories are posted every week, and you won't want to sleep through them. Until next time, sweet dreams. If you can sleep, that is.